Time for this debate has expired. Call on private and local orders of the day, number 1.
Christian Churches New Zealand Property Trust Bill, Empowering Bill, first reading.
Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the Christian Churches New Zealand Property Trust Board Empowering Bill be now read a first time. I will nominate the Government and Administration Committee to consider the bill. Mr. Speaker, the Christian Churches of New Zealand is an association of more than 30 congregations that began in Nelson in 1844. I have the privilege as the local MP to sponsor this private bill that enables these Christian churches to modernise their property trust board. The Christian Churches movement began in the early 1800s in both the UK and the US out of concern that the more traditional churches were too rigid and authoritarian. Their focus was on unity and teachings of the New Testament. The church grew rapidly in New Zealand from its Nelson beginnings, soon after which the nation was formed with the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi. New congregations were formed in Auckland in 1845, in Dunedin in 1858, in Christchurch in 1870, and by 1885 had grown to 25 churches across the country. I'm particularly proud of the strength and contribution of the 6 churches in the Nelson region: the Unite Church in the city, the Annesbrook Church in Stoke, the Church of Christ in Richmond, the Alive Church of Christ in Motueka, and the Takaka Church of Christ. In my work previously as the MP for Tasman and as the MP for Nelson, I've seen in person the huge contribution these churches have made in working with youth, in supporting family members in the time of bereavement, supporting families in hardship, and that generosity has spread well beyond just those members in their fellowship. The churches have grown strongly over that time, and I have been the benefactor of some of that growth. 20 years ago, the Annesbrook congregation in Stoke outgrew its premises and built a wonderful new complex in Saxton Road. I purchased their old hall and church manse for my electorate office and home. The media at the time joked that it was probably my best prospect of becoming a minister by purchasing a church. I do recall at that time my dealings with the Church Property Trust and was impressed with the honesty and integrity of that transaction. The reason for this bill is that the 1929 Act that governs the management of these church properties is outdated and needs modernising. It is a private bill and does not impact on any other people's property. I've met with all of the churches concerned at their annual conference and noted their strong support for this sensible reform. The bill dissolves the existing trust, repeals the existing Act, and transfers all properties to a new standard charitable trust under the 1957 Act. It ensures that all the legal obligations of the old trust transfers to the new. It also transfers all of the properties from the old to the new. It is worthwhile noting the history of the current Act in setting out the planned future governance of these church properties. Initially, each of the church properties was vested in each autonomous congregation in the name of church elders. This was not entirely practical, and in the 1920s, the Conference of Churches decided to have a legal entity that could own all the properties. The legal entity was incorporated as the Church Extension and Property Trust Board of the Associated Churches of Christ in New Zealand. There was some doubt then about the legal capacity of the board to hold all those properties vested within it, and so the private act was passed by this Parliament in 1929. A new trust was formed after agreement at the 2013 Conference of the Churches, but this bill is required to execute the transfer. The new trust has interim trustees and has appointed a solicitor, Mr. Vestas Ailments, whom I have worked with and pay tribute to for the work in bringing this bill to the House. The key difference enabled by this trust change is that the new trust has a wider reference. whereas the 1929 Act has limited the assets to be only used for property purposes, and any property sold would only be able to be used for that purpose, the new Act and Trust would enable the assets to be used for the wider mission and outreach work of the associated churches. The churches resolved in 2012 also to change their name from the Churches of Christ to the Christian Churches of New Zealand. Mr. Speaker, I am of the Christian faith and hold huge respect for the role churches play in our communities and the development of our society. I cannot speak for all of the 40 congregations across New Zealand, but I am a strong admirer of the work of these Christian churches in my home community of Nelson. This Parliament should support this quite sensible reform of their property governance structure. I did note, somewhat jokingly from my colleague, the Attorney General, that he would be fronting an amendment to enable the churches to be able to return to the true faith in Rome. I am hoping that other colleagues will take a more charitable and Christian perspective. Mr. Speaker, I do note the degree to which the Christian churches of New Zealand are already engaged internationally with the wider family of churches, and in fact many of the parishes in New Zealand, 10 of them in fact, are union churches involved in partnerships with other denominations. This bill is simply about letting these 40 churches more flexibly manage their own property, and I commend it to the House.
The question is that the motion be agreed to.
Mr. Speaker.
Stuart Nash.